And we're actually bringing in investigative journalist from Channel 4 News in London, Krishnan Guru-Murthy, to talk more about this investigation with us. First, thank you so much for taking time to be here. Let's talk about Trump's digital campaign called the Deterrence Project, and specifically how it led to voter suppression in 2016.
Well, what we discovered by analysing this huge database was that in different batches, and black voters were disproportionately placed in this category called deterrence, which tells us that the aim of targeting these people was to deter them from voting. Effectively, they knew that they couldn't win them over. They weren't in the category called persuasion, and so they couldn't be persuaded to vote for Donald Trump, but they might be persuaded to stay at home. And so what happened after that was a lot of ads were targeted at those people on social media and on traditional media that tried to tell them that Hillary Clinton, the candidate, was no friend of the black community, that she thought of young black men as super predators, dating back to a speech she had given many years ago, that Michelle Obama was no great fan of Hillary Clinton as president, to try and turn people off.
Now, can you explain what dark posts are / ads, and how they work on social media platforms, and why it's actually hard to have a full record of those posts / ads?
Well, this is something that's changed since 2016. Back then, a dark ad on Facebook was something that would appear in your newsfeed, and it would look a lot like the updates that you get from your friends and family. You know, not so obviously a commercial, and then you wouldn't be able to find it after that. There would be no record of it.
Sure.
So it would disappear effectively. So that's made it very, very difficult to go back and trace what the ads were, precisely what they were saying. So very hard to work out how many of them were telling the truth, how many of them were disinformation, or just downright lies, and what happened to them. These days, dark posts still happen of a kind, but there is an ad library on Facebook, so you can go back and trace what these ads are and what they are saying. So it makes it a little harder these days to mislead in the same way without being detected.
Sure. Now, back then, they actually used to disappear. So I'm curious, how was your team able to discover how they were being used if they did disappear?
Well, I mean, our investigation was principally into the categorization of voters on the database. But
Sure.
what I then did was go knock on doors. So we took the list of names. We went to Wisconsin, and we cross-referenced that against the voter roll to see who had voted and who had not. And so we looked through the list of people who hadn't voted in 2016 and went and knocked on their doors and said, did you know that you were on a list? You were targeted for deterrence. Do you remember using Facebook? Do you remember these ads? And so we showed them some of the ads that we do have records of because they were saved on things like YouTube, and showed them and said, you know, do you remember these sorts of campaigns? A lot of them did.
And let's also talk about Trump's 2016 digital campaign called Project Alamo and how it's tied to the now defunct British company Cambridge Analytica.
Well, Cambridge Analytica were working for the Trump campaign. And so they were crucially involved in the creation of this database together with the Republican National Committee. It was a team of people who are now well known as the people who were part of this notorious company that ended up collapsing when their tactics and their ethically questionable ways of doing business were exposed by an investigation by Channel 4 News, in which an undercover reporter approached the bosses of Cambridge Analytica as a potential client, and they frankly boasted about all the dastardly things they got up to with international election campaigns around the world. The company collapsed. But back then, they were crucially involved in creating this database.
My understanding is now individuals from Cambridge Analytica are working for the 2020 Trump campaign as well. Is that true?
Yes, there are people who were involved then who are still involved now, and of course Brad Parscale, who's been in the news recently, was intimately involved back then as well. So yeah, there is some crossover. We don't know what they're doing now because we don't have their database as it currently is.
Sure.
But what you can be pretty certain of, I would imagine, is that they have continued to build on those techniques and built on that database. Obviously, everybody uses targeted advertising. There's nothing very surprising about that.
Yeah.
But it's what you do with the database and what your aim is. And in this case, what's been really controversial with civil rights groups is the idea that you can seek to deter people. And they see that as the continuation of a dark history in the United States of trying to suppress the votes of black people.
Now, was anything that was done through the Deterrence Project or through Project Alamo illegal?
Well, we haven't discovered anything that is illegal, and we haven't made any such allegations. There are some suggestions that cases could be brought based on what was done with the data. So the state of Michigan, for example, are looking at the kinds of messages that were put out on social media to see if they were willfully wrong. And if this was deliberately misleading or deliberately lying to people, then there's some suggestion that there may be legal action as a result of that. But certainly from our investigation, we've not drawn attention to anything that is currently illegal. The question is it ethical? Is it moral to try and deter people from voting? Is it in the spirit of democracy?
Sure. Now, this revealed a lot about the 2016 election, but what do we know about the 2020 Trump digital strategy?
Well, I mean, if you take a look at what's going on social media and on TV right now, it doesn't take too much to work out what's going on. The Trump campaign have obviously been focusing very strongly on law and order as a result of a summer of anti-racist Black Lives Matter protests, which in some areas have also led to some violence and rioting. So those images of burning buildings in places like Kenosha or Portland, Oregon, are repeating, over and over and over again. And if you go and talk to people, as we did, who were in the persuasion category of voters, now these are mostly white middle-class voters who were regarded as people who could be pushed into being Trump supporters back in 2016. What we did was go and talk to them and say, are you seeing these ads about law and order right now? And what do you think about them? They were really going down very well with these voters. So, what I think you can probably surmise is that those sorts of voters are being targeted with those particular messages because what they know from the database is that those voters put law and order very high up on the list of issues that they regard as important. Because that was the key thing about this database. It wasn't just about how they categorized people. It had a huge amount of information on what they thought people cared about, what were their key issues. And given so many people care about law and order, I think that's what's going on right now.
Fascinating. From Channel 4 News across the pond, thank you so much, Krishnan. We really appreciate you joining us here on NBCLX.
Thanks.